And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk about the prophet Samuel. Did the prophet Samuel have an immortal soul? A lot of people think he did. A lot of people think that what happened with Saul in the 28th chapter of 1 Samuel, they believe that what happened with Saul actually proves that there is an immortal soul inside of man. Now, a couple of questions before we get on with some of these scriptures. Why would God break his own law? If Samuel is up in heaven and he sent Samuel down to talk to Saul through a witch, why would God break his own law? Because the Bible plainly says in Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, verses 10 through 12, that you shall not consult with familiar spirits. And you shall not have witches and warlocks and use witchcraft in the land. So why would God break his own laws, send Samuel down and talk to Saul through a witch? Now, does Samuel have an immortal soul? Is this proof in the 28th chapter, 1 Samuel, is this proof that there is an immortal soul inside of man? Well, let's go through this. In 1 Samuel, the 28th chapter, here we see Samuel died, verse 3. And then we see in verse 4 that the Philistines were gathered together. And in verse 5 it says, Saul saw the host of the Philistines. He was afraid in his heart, and he greatly trembled. So here we see Saul. On top of that, David is breathing down his neck, ready to take over the throne of Israel. Here we see Saul in desperate need. His whole world is starting to crash down all around him. The man is desperate. And then it says here, in verse 6, that when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by the prophets. Now, he inquired of the Lord, but at this time, he abandoned God. The Bible plainly says in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, verse 13, that Saul abandoned God. You can also read that in 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter, verse 11. God says that Samuel turned his back from me. He stopped obeying God, but he inquired of the Lord. Why did he do that? Well, that was pretty much standard procedure in ancient Israel to inquire of the Lord. It says here from the Jameson Fawcett Brown commentary, it says, since it was a part of the official duty of the high priest to ask counsel for rulers in all matters affecting the national interest of Israel, it appears that Saul also, in the brief period of his theocratic allegiance, inquired of the Lord through the same medium. And you can read that in 1 Samuel 14, 18 through 19, and also verse 37. It says, but he had long discontinued such applications, his impulsive and wayward temper driving him to neglect him, probably from the day that God gave him no answer. So here he's inquiring of the Lord. It's not like he was still obeying God. He abandoned God, but he was desperate. These desperate times call for desperate measures. So God didn't answer him. So here we go in verse 7. It says, Saul said unto his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said unto him, behold, there was a woman with a familiar spirit at Endor. So he turned to paganism. He abandoned God. Why would he turn to paganism? Well, because he believed in some of the pagan concepts, including the immortal soul. He abandoned God long ago. If he was still obeying God, he wouldn't have gone to paganism, but that's exactly what he did. He abandoned God. On top of that, if you notice, when David would play the harp for that God, when God stopped answering, God allowed a demonic presence to trouble him. You can read that in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. He allowed a demonic presence to trouble him. So this demonic presence was troubling him and eventually influenced him because of his emotional state, the way he was. It was very fragile emotional state, and when a person is in that emotional state, it's easy for a demon to influence a person, and that's what was happening with Saul. Saul was being influenced by a demonic spirit, And not just here, but throughout his reign when he abandoned God. And so this is why he consulted a witch at Endor, because he started to believe in these pagan practices. He started to believe in the immortal soul. And so he went to this witch at Endor. Now let's go on to verse 9, where it says, Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? And this is, of course, in the early part of Saul's reign, when Saul was, he had a zeal for God and his law, but there were still familiar spirits in the land that Saul kept. After he abandoned God, he kept those familiar spirits around just in case he needed them. This is why they were still in the land. But it was illegal. And not because of Saul, but because the Israelites were still obeying God. And they did not abandon God. So it was still the law of the land, the law of God. All right, so verse 10, it says, Saul sware to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. And again, this is not because he obeyed God. This was just a standard practice, as the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary says. This was a standard practice in the land of when you swear to someone, they would say, I swear by the Lord, or as the Lord liveth. It's just common language. It's not that he obeyed God. And you can read that in the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary. Verse 11, it says, Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up to thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. Now, he should know better. But obviously he abandoned God, because the Bible plainly says that the dead know not anything. Ecclesiastes 9:5. Psalm 146:4 plainly says that when people die, their thoughts perish. That people that are dead, it says, they sleep with their fathers. In Isaiah, the 8th chapter, God plainly says in verse 19, Why do you seek the dead concerning the living? Because the dead know not anything. They're dead in their graves. Saul should have known that. But, well, actually, he probably did when he obeyed God, but he abandoned God. He abandoned God and, of course, started to take up these pagan beliefs. That's why he said, Bring me up Samuel. Now, verse 12, it says, Now when the woman saw Samuel, now it's not that she saw Samuel, this is the narrator of the book telling us what they perceived was Samuel, as you read in verse 14. It says, Saul perceived that it was Samuel. So the narrator is just telling us what they perceived, what they thought they saw. So the woman saw Samuel, then she found out that she was talking to Saul. You've deceived me, you are Saul. Then verse 13, it says, And the king said unto her, Don't be afraid. What did you see? Now we see what she actually saw. It says, And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. Or, as it should read, I saw a god-like being ascend out of the earth. Now, wait a minute. If Samuel's immortal soul is up in heaven, why is he ascending out of the earth? Why isn't he coming down from heaven? I mean, if that's the way the story goes, immortal souls go wafting off into heaven, how come he's not coming down? Why is he coming up out of the earth? The narrator is actually telling us that this is a demon, that this is a characteristic of a demon coming up out of the earth. So it says here, I saw a godlike being come up out of the earth, and he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. And it says, And Samuel said to Saul. Now, it's not that it's actually Samuel. The narrator is just telling us what they perceived they saw. So it says, Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me, and bring me up? Not down from heaven. It says, Bring me up. Again, if it was immortal soul, why doesn't he say, Bring me down from heaven? It says, Bring me up. And then Saul said about how the Philistines are making war. God departed from me. He answers me no more, and so on. Then Samuel, well, the familiar spirit, because First Chronicles, the 10th chapter, verse 13 says that they inquired of a familiar spirit, not Samuel. But the narrator here is just saying, then said Samuel, what they perceived was Samuel. And then it says, all these things that were going to happen, which was the truth. And many times in the Bible, we see demons telling the truth. And one example is Luke, the 4th chapter, verse 41. So here we see a demon mixing the truth with deception, of letting Saul believe that it was Samuel that he saw. And of course, he was telling him the truth of what was going to happen. So obviously, there is no immortal soul here. This is a familiar spirit deceiving Saul, pretending that he's Samuel, and nothing here in the text indicates that there is an immortal soul. So to say that these scriptures in 1 Samuel, the 28th chapter, prove that Samuel has an immortal soul is just another Bible misconception.